Effective immediately, your contract is terminated, pending a full investigation for corporate fraud and gross negligence. The words echoed with a cold, metallic finality in the sterile, windowless conference room on the 38th floor of Sterling Global Holdings. A room designed specifically to intimidate and isolate those called within its frosted glass walls. Dara Vance sat perfectly still in her standard issue ergonomic chair, her posture impeccable despite the suffocating tension. As a 35-year-old black woman who had spent the last 7 years operating in the shadows as a mid-level project staff coordinator, she was the invisible glue that held the massive, sprawling logistics department together. The woman who meticulously took the notes, fetched the relentlessly updated spreadsheets, and blended seamlessly into the gray upholstery while highly paid executives made million-dollar decisions over her head. Across the expansive, polished mahogany table sat Valerie Sterling, the vice president of operations, wearing a tailored, aggressively expensive pale blue blazer, her hands folded neatly, almost piously, over a pristine legal pad that held the fabricated evidence of Dara's supposed crimes. Beside her sat Derek, the fiercely ambitious senior director whose primary, perhaps only, corporate talent was stealing credit for other people's late-night labor and presenting it with a charismatic smile to the board of directors. "You want me to take the fall for the Phoenix Project discrepancy?" Dara stated flatly, not phrasing it as a question, her voice terrifyingly calm, a smooth, deep timbre that absolutely refused to tremble even as the metaphorical axe hovered millimeters from her neck. "We have the digital audit trails, Dara," Valerie sighed dramatically, projecting a highly practiced, theatrical disappointment designed to make her look like the victim of a trusted employee's betrayal. "The missing vendor payouts were undeniably authorized under your specific digital signature, so security will escort you downstairs immediately. And I strongly suggest you don't make a scene for your own sake." Dara looked down at the sharply printed termination letter, reflecting on 7 grueling years of being talked over in crucial meetings. 7 years of having her brilliant logistical proposals ruthlessly stripped of her name and shamelessly presented by people exactly like Derek. 7 years of being treated like a glorified, expendable secretary rather than the highly educated project coordinator she actually was. She stood up slowly, deliberately smoothing the front of her modest, unassuming pencil skirt, choosing not to scream or defend herself, because what the smug Valerie and the smirking Derek fundamentally did not know was that the audit trail they had so cleverly manipulated was indeed a trap. But it most certainly was not Dara's trap. "I'll find my own way to the elevator," Dara said softly, her tone betraying absolutely nothing. And as she gracefully turned her back on the very people who genuinely believed they had just decisively ruined her life and career, a microscopic, almost imperceptible smile of pure anticipation touched the corner of her lips. "If you truly want to know everything about the deeply buried secrets of a massive multinational corporation, do not ever become its chief executive officer, but rather become the invisible person who schedules their confidential meetings, meticulously compiles their raw, unfiltered data, and casually orders their overpriced catered lunches for exactly 2,555 agonizingly slow days." Dara had painstakingly perfected the nuanced art of absolute invisibility within the cutthroat corporate ecosystem. As a project staffer, her deliberately ambiguous title meant she had unhindered, unquestioned access to almost every single department in the building, operating as cross-functional support, which was simply a polite corporate euphemism for the person everyone lazily dumps their unwanted, tedious tasks on, because her official title lacked the commanding words manager or director. The arrogant executive spoke incredibly freely around her, arrogantly assuming she lacked the financial literacy to understand the complex, offshore ledgers she was collating and binding for them. They falsely assumed a quiet black woman diligently organizing their messy, chaotic vendor files, was simply grateful to have a steady paycheck and health insurance, never once looking closely enough to see the razor-sharp analytical mind processing every single syllable they uttered. Every single morning at precisely 7:30, Dara walked through the grand, intimidating marble lobby of Sterling Global. Swiping her standard issue, low-level blue employee badge that explicitly restricted her from the executive lounges, but ironically granted her access to the deepest digital archives. She vividly remembered just last Tuesday when Derek had carelessly spilled a scalding venti caramel macchiato on the pristine hallway floor right in front of her shoes, tossing a dismissive "get facilities on that, would you, sweetheart" over his shoulder without bothering to make eye contact. An insult she absorbed quietly while simply wiping it up herself to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. She sat silently in countless agonizing budget meetings where she watched Valerie systematically and ruthlessly slash the essential overtime pay for the exhausted warehouse workers, while simultaneously, in the very same breath, inexplicably inflating the monthly retainer for a mysterious consulting firm that predictably produced nothing but 50-page PDFs filled with meaningless corporate buzzwords. Dara saw it all with perfect, unclouded clarity, witnessing the quiet, manufactured terminations of exceptionally good, honest analysts who foolishly asked too many logical questions about the numbers, and she meticulously observed the toxic culture of pervasive fear and blind obedience that Valerie had systematically cultivated, brick by deceitful brick, across the entire operations floor. At night, driving her sensible sedan back to the modest suburban home she shared with her husband, Marcus, a brilliant and deeply empathetic high school history teacher, she would let the stoic mask slip, allowing him to gently massage her tense shoulders as she exhaustively cataloged the daily, grinding indignities. "Why do you stay in that snake pit?" Marcus would ask softly, seeing the profound exhaustion deeply etched into her beautiful features. "You have a master's degree in finance from Wharton, Dara. You could literally walk into any top-tier firm on Wall Street tomorrow and be a vice president in 3 years. So why do you let these mediocre people treat you like a doormat?" "Because," Dara would whisper softly, leaning her heavy head back against his warm chest and closing her tired eyes, "the foundation of that company is completely rotting from the inside out, and you cannot ever fix a crumbling foundation from the comfort of the penthouse suite. You have to be willing to get down in the dirt and dig up the rot with your own 2 hands. What absolutely nobody at the sprawling corporate headquarters knew, not even the most aggressive, well-connected investigative journalists who ruthlessly covered the logistics sector, was that Dara's legal last name was not actually Vance, but rather, it was undeniably Sterling. Dara was the sole biological granddaughter of Josephine Sterling, the famously ruthless, spectacularly visionary black matriarch who had fiercely built Sterling Global Holdings from a single, struggling regional supply chain warehouse in the late 70s into a multi-billion-dollar international logistics empire that currently dominated the global shipping lanes. When Josephine's ironclad health finally began to unexpectedly fail her in her early 80s, she had urgently summoned Dara, her only remaining blood heir, to her heavily guarded, state-of-the-art private hospital suite overlooking the city she had effectively conquered. "They are absolute vultures, Dara. Every single one of them," her grandmother had wheezed painfully, gripping Dara's hand with a shocking, desperate strength that defied her frail appearance. "The entire board of directors, the bloated vice presidents, and especially my own treacherous niece, Valerie, because they only care about extracting the quarterly profits to pad their own offshore accounts, absolutely disregarding the hardworking people who actually bleed on the warehouse floors for this company every day. I cannot simply hand you the throne on a silver platter just because you share my blood and my last name. Because if I do, they will eat you alive before you even sit in the chair. You have to truly earn the absolute right to protect my people by understanding exactly what they endure. What exactly do you want me to do? Nanadara had asked quietly, feeling the immense, crushing weight of a multi-billion-dollar legacy suddenly shifting onto her young shoulders in that sterile room. Change your legal name, bury your Ivy League credentials, and go directly into the dark belly of the beast by starting at the very bottom as basic project support. And you will stay down there in the trenches for exactly 7 years. That will be long enough to let their polished corporate masks completely fall off. Long enough for them to arrogantly show you exactly who they truly are when they firmly believe you are entirely powerless and insignificant to their grand schemes. And only then, armed with the undeniable truth, will you know exactly who to fire without mercy and who to rightfully promote. It was, by all conventional modern business metrics, a completely insane, deeply archaic request that demanded the sacrifice of her youth and immediate career trajectory, but Dara profoundly loved her fierce grandmother, and she deeply revered the foundational, working-class legacy of the massive company. She accepted the heavy mandate without hesitation, fully disclosing her true lineage and the secret mission to Marcus, because there were absolutely no secrets in their rock-solid marriage. Though she consciously chose to hide the agonizing, true extent of Valerie's daily emotional abuse from him, fiercely protecting her 7-year mission from his righteous, protective anger that surely would have blown her carefully constructed cover. Now, exactly 7 years to the month since that fateful hospital room promise, the legendary Josephine had peacefully passed away, prompting the greedy, impatient board of directors to rapidly prepare to formally announce Valerie as the new, uncontested chief executive officer, blissfully unaware that Dara was finally, lethally ready to cash in 7 years' worth of meticulously collected receipts. The rampant financial corruption festering at the top levels of Sterling Global wasn't even remotely elegant or sophisticated, and honestly, that was the most profoundly insulting part of the entire situation to Dara's highly trained, analytical mind. Valerie was blatantly stealing millions from the corporate coffers, but she was doing it so lazily and arrogantly, entirely protected by a carefully curated ecosystem of spineless sycophants who were either too terrified of losing their lucrative jobs or too heavily bribed to ever dare audit her sprawling, untethered divisions. Dara's seemingly menial role in project staffing heavily involved the tedious task of reconciling the seemingly innocuous, miscellaneous logistical expenses for Q3, a mundane task nobody else wanted to touch, which allowed her to notice that for the past 3 consecutive years, a mysterious shell logistics company curiously named Apex Solutions had been quietly but consistently absorbing exactly 15% of the total regional shipping budget. Whenever Dara casually attempted to bring this glaring anomaly to the attention of her direct, heavily sweating supervisor, she was rapidly and aggressively shut down, explicitly told, "That specific vendor account is way above your pay grade, Dara. So just format the Excel cells, highlight the bottom line totals in yellow, and mind your own business if you want to keep your job." So, Dara obligingly did exactly that during business hours, obediently formatting the cells and remaining silent, but on her strictly timed 30-minute lunch breaks, sitting invisibly in her unremarkable car in the sprawling concrete parking structure, she booted up a personal, heavily encrypted laptop and relentlessly tracked the convoluted routing numbers through international banking databases. She soon definitively discovered that Apex Solutions was not a logistics firm at all, but a hollow LLC registered in a rundown strip mall in Delaware, legally owned on paper by Valerie's unemployed brother-in-law. Proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Valerie was aggressively siphoning massive employee bonus pools and emergency operational funds to lavishly fund her third, multi-million-dollar vacation home nestled in the exclusive mountains of Aspen. Furthermore, her arrogant lackey Derek was effectively operating as her brutal corporate enforcer, the aggressive bulldog who physically intimidated and verbally bullied the overworked accounting department into blindly signing off on the massive quarterly discrepancies without asking any pesky follow-up questions. Dara absolutely didn't just save the digital files to a flash drive. She methodically built an impenetrable, legally bulletproof fortress of damning evidence that chronicled every passive-aggressive threatening email, every blatantly falsified vendor invoice, and every tragic instance where a hardworking, honest employee was unjustly fired and stripped of their severance, just to quietly cover up a sudden budgetary shortfall caused by Valerie's theft. She securely transmitted encrypted copies of every single damning document to a highly secure, offline private server meticulously managed by her late grandmother's fiercely loyal estate lawyer, Arthur Ashford, a formidable, silver-haired man who was quietly, patiently waiting in the shadows for the brutal 7-year clock to finally strike midnight so they could spring the ultimate trap. Dara had effectively become an untraceable ghost gathering lethal ammunition within the corporate machine. But existing as a ghost took a severe, compounding psychological toll on her soul as she was forced to stand by and watch genuinely good, hardworking people get systematically destroyed by Valerie's unquenchable greed. She vividly remembered watching Patricia, a brilliant, 50-year-old single mother and arguably the most talented logistics manager in the entire Eastern Division, get brutally bullied into an impoverished early retirement simply because she had independently noticed the exact same glaring financial anomalies that Dara had. And while Dara desperately wanted to furiously intervene then, to scream the truth and expose them all to the press, she forced herself to bite her tongue until it bled, logically knowing that striking prematurely would only clip a small, replaceable branch of the corruption, rather than permanently killing the toxic, deeply embedded root, the absolute hardest, also, and most soul-crushing part of enduring those agonizing 7 years in the corporate shadows wasn't the constant disrespect and dismissiveness directed toward herself. It was being forced to silently witness the devastating, life-altering collateral damage inflicted on innocent, hard-working employees. There was the heartbreaking case of Thomas, the deeply dedicated night shift security chief who had proudly and flawlessly worked at Sterling Global for over 20 years, single-handedly putting his 3 children through college on his modest salary. One rainy evening in November, Thomas properly and strictly followed company protocol by officially logging a formal incident report, noting that Senior Director Derek was completely unauthorized in the building at 2 a.m, physically accessing highly confidential, restricted employee files in the Human Resources Department without the required executive clearance. Less than 2 weeks after filing that honest report, Thomas was suddenly, ruthlessly stripped of his hard-earned badge and brutally demoted to a daytime outdoor parking attendant role in the freezing weather, his long-term company pension permanently and maliciously capped just months before he reached full maturation. Dara had tragically found the stoic, proud man sitting completely alone in the dingy basement break room, staring blankly and defeatedly at his aggressively phrased reassignment letter, tears welling in his tired eyes. And she had quietly sat across from him, gently sliding a warm cup of coffee toward his trembling, calloused hands. They coldly told me I fundamentally violated security protocol by harassing a senior executive, Thomas had whispered, his voice violently cracking with the sheer injustice of it all. I just honestly wrote down exactly what I saw on the cameras. Dara, because that is literally what they pay me to do. I absolutely know you did. Thomas, and I know it isn't fair, she had whispered back fervently, her heart breaking because she was entirely unable to say anything more without instantly blowing her critical, long-term undercover operation. Just keep your head down, survive this, and wait just a little longer. I promise you things will change. Then, there was the infuriating case of Elena, a brilliantly sharp, deeply optimistic junior data analyst who had naively, trusting the company's fake open-door policy, brought a massive, glaring discrepancy in the quarterly regional bonus distributions directly to Valerie's corner office. Valerie had smiled sweetly, thanked her profusely for her diligent oversight, and then, within a single month, systematically turned Elena's daily work environment into an inescapable, psychologically torturous living hell by deliberately isolating her from all critical team meetings, assigning her physically impossible overnight data deadlines, and publicly, viciously berating her in front of the entire floor for microscopic, irrelevant typos in draft emails. Elena eventually suffered a severe panic attack in the restroom and quietly quit without any severance pay. Heavily suffering from severe, induced workplace anxiety that derailed her promising career, leaving behind a completely empty cubicle and a profoundly tragic, small yellow sticky note stuck to her monitor that simply read, "I genuinely thought hard work and honesty were enough." Dara had quietly, respectfully packed up Elena's few remaining desk belongings for her, carefully peeling that heartbreaking sticky note off the plastic monitor frame and gently placing it inside her own personal, worn leather journal, where it instantly became her daily, sacred mantra for survival. Whenever Dara felt completely exhausted, whenever she desperately felt like quitting the insane mission, whenever Derek rudely handed her his literal trash to throw away, or whenever Valerie disgustingly referred to her as the help in front of visiting international clients, Dara would mentally visualize that exact yellow note. She fiercely realized that she wasn't just staying in the dirt for her beloved grandmother's historical legacy anymore. She was enduring the daily fire to violently avenge Thomas, Elena, Patricia, and the hundreds of other invisible, essential workers who had literally built the massive company that Valerie was currently ruthlessly strip mining for her own extravagant luxury. Derek's suffocating, unchecked arrogance ultimately and spectacularly blinded him to the lethal danger quietly observing him from the corner of the room, because he didn't just want to casually steal millions from the company. He pathologically demanded absolute, humiliating submission from every single person he deemed beneath his inflated executive status. Exactly 6 agonizing months before the strict 7-year deadline was finally set to expire, the company hosted its lavish, notoriously excessive annual charity gala at the most expensive, exclusive downtown hotel, an event where even low-level administrative employees were graciously allowed to attend and bring their spouses to maintain the false public illusion of a happy corporate family. Dara confidently attended the opulent event with her husband Marcus, and dressed in a stunning, beautifully tailored, yet elegantly understated emerald green evening gown that perfectly complemented her dark skin. She looked absolutely radiant, completely shedding her everyday office invisibility. Marcus, standing exceptionally tall and exuding a quiet, commanding academic confidence, held her arm proudly as they gracefully navigated the crowded, champagne-soaked ballroom, politely keeping to themselves near the periphery of the extravagant ice sculptures and caviar stations. Derek, already several extremely expensive glasses of Scotch deep and visibly flushed with his own perceived importance, aggressively approached their small table, immediately looking Marcus up and down with obvious, dripping disdain, noting the clearly off-the-rack, modest suit that contrasted sharply with the bespoke Italian tailoring worn by the other executives. "So, you must be the incredibly lucky husband of our little, quiet data drone," Derek sneered loudly, intentionally drawing the curious stares of nearby junior executives as he took a sloppy sip of his drink. "You really must be so proud. Because she makes a hell of a beautifully formatted spreadsheet when she actually follows basic instructions." Marcus instantly tightened his strong jaw, every protective instinct flaring up, fully realizing exactly the kind of toxic, entitled corporate bully he was currently dealing with, but he maintained his absolute composure. "I am incredibly, deeply proud of her every single day," Marcus replied smoothly, his voice projecting a calm, dangerous authority. "Dara is without a doubt the smartest, most capable person in any room she ever walks into, including this one." Derek laughed loudly, a sharp braying sound designed to humiliate, deliberately trying to embarrass them further in front of the growing crowd of eavesdropping colleagues. "Smart, sure. I guess she's smart enough to know exactly how to do exactly what she's told, without asking stupid questions. Which reminds me, Dara, I urgently need the Q4 regional logistics projections physically printed on my desk by 8 o'clock sharp on Monday morning. So don't you dare be late or blame the traffic." Dara acutely felt all the muscles in Marcus's back violently tense under his suit jacket, and she quickly, firmly squeezed his large hand, delivering a silent, desperate command for him to stand down and protect the mission. "The report will be there right on time." "Derek, just as it always is," she said evenly, her face a completely blank, unreadable mask of professional deference. But Derek, completely drunk on his own perceived untouchable power, simply couldn't leave well enough alone and had to push the knife in just a little deeper. "You know, Marcus, if your wife actually showed just a little more proactive initiative around the office, and maybe bothered to smile a bit more when I speak to her, I might actually consider promoting her out of the filing basement eventually." Marcus took one slow, deliberate step forward, looking Derek dead in his bleary, arrogant eyes with a chilling intensity that momentarily silenced the immediate area. "The foundational basement is exactly what holds the entire massive building up, Derek. So I highly recommend you remember that terrifying fact when the ground inevitably starts shaking beneath your expensive shoes." Derek just rolled his eyes dismissively, letting out a condescending scoff before clumsily turning and walking away, completely dismissing them as insignificant nobodies who didn't matter to his grand, wealthy future. He absolutely didn't realize that Marcus's stern, poetic words weren't just a clever, defensive metaphor, but rather a literal, impending prophecy, and Derek's pathetic, insecure need to publicly humiliate Dara in front of her fiercely loyal husband had just permanently, irreversibly moved his bolded name to the very top of her corporate execution list. Valerie acutely and desperately knew that the heavily manipulated board of directors was finally set to officially vote her in as the new chief executive officer at the end of the week. But the sudden, highly problematic disappearance of exactly $2.4 million from the highly sensitive Phoenix Project accounts was rapidly drawing extremely unwanted, dangerous attention from sharp external financial auditors. She absolutely needed a perfect, disposable scapegoat immediately. Someone with just enough digital access to the internal banking systems to make the lie plausible, but situated low enough on the corporate totem pole that absolutely nobody in the building would ever dare advocate for them, or demand a deeper, costly forensic investigation. Dara, the quiet, perpetually invisible project coordinator who never complained and ostensibly had no powerful corporate allies, was the absolutely perfect, incredibly convenient target for their desperate, malicious cover-up operation, using Derek's highly unethical, backdoor connections within the compromised IT department. They maliciously and systematically cloned Dara's internal IP address, creating a fake, encrypted digital tunnel that made it appear as though she was operating from her desk after hours. They then deliberately forged a damning series of complex authorization emails, effectively and explicitly linking Dara's specific employee ID number and digital signature directly to the illegal transfer of the missing Phoenix funds into several untraceable offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands. It was a remarkably sloppy, rushed, and deeply flawed frame-up job, meaning anyone doing even a basic, competent forensic digital dive would instantly see that the hidden metadata didn't match her actual workstation's hardware registry. But the arrogant Valerie confidently calculated that she didn't actually need the flimsy evidence to miraculously hold up in a strict federal court of law. She merely needed it to hold up in a terrifying HR meeting just long enough to justify immediately firing Dara, confiscating her laptop, and permanently burying the audited files under a mountain of non-disclosure agreements, which inevitably brought them directly back to the suffocating, windowless conference room on the 38th floor, where Dara sat perfectly still and accepted her unjust termination without a single tear or plea for mercy. As Dara slowly walked out of the massive glass building with her small, sad cardboard box of personal desk items, flanked aggressively by 2 large security guards acting exactly like she was a dangerous, convicted criminal, she closely scanned the faces of the dozens of people she had quietly and diligently worked alongside for exactly 7 long years. Some of her former colleagues cowardly looked away in deep shame, staring intensely at their shoes, while others viciously whispered malicious gossip behind their hands. But absolutely nobody, not a single soul, bravely stood up to defend her stellar character or question the absurd allegations. The toxic, suffocating culture of absolute fear and blind loyalty that Valerie had ruthlessly built over the decade was total and complete, ensuring that everyone simply accepted the official narrative to protect their own fragile paychecks. Dara gracefully reached her sensible sedan in the sprawling parking structure, calmly placed the cardboard box in the trunk, closed it with a soft thud, and immediately dialed a highly encrypted, unlisted phone number on her personal device. "Mr. Ashford," she said softly but firmly when the deep, resonant, and instantly recognizable voice of the chairman of the board finally answered the secure line. Ashford, her late grandmother's absolute oldest, most trusted friend and confidant, was the only other living person in the entire corporate hierarchy who knew exactly who Dara truly was and the immense, terrifying power she legally wielded. "Is it finally done?" Dara Ashford asked quietly, his voice vibrating with a dangerous, barely contained anticipation after years of playing the senile. "Compliant chairman, for Valerie's benefit, they literally just fired me for the Phoenix discrepancy 30 minutes ago, exactly as we predicted," she confirmed, staring up at the towering glass facade of the building. "The comprehensive audit logs and the unredacted offshore routing numbers are fully securely in your possession. I personally have every single page, every single deleted email, and every single digital fingerprint." "My dear," Ashford replied smoothly, "the final, decisive board meeting is scheduled for exactly 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Are you finally ready to claim your rightful seat at the head of the table?" Dara looked fiercely up at the massive, glowing corporate logo that literally bore her family's actual name. Feeling the accumulated weight of 7 years of humiliation morph instantly into cold, pure, unadulterated resolve. "I'm not just going to politely claim the empty seat. Arthur," she stated with absolute, terrifying conviction, "I'm going to completely violently flip the entire damn table over and watch them all scramble." When the newly terminated Dara finally arrived back at her quiet suburban home late that unexpectedly stressful afternoon, she immediately found Marcus sitting patiently on the front porch steps, already waiting for her because he had acutely sensed the shift in the timeline based on her brief, cryptic text message. He gently but firmly took the pathetic cardboard box from her hands, setting it unceremoniously on the wooden steps, and immediately pulled her into a fiercely tight, incredibly protective embrace that finally allowed her to exhale the breath she felt like she had been holding for 7 agonizing years. "So it's really over. They actually did it?" he asked softly, his deep voice thick with a mixture of immense relief and simmering, protective anger as he buried his face in her hair. I am officially suspended without pay pending a full internal investigation. And tomorrow morning, Valerie is aggressively going to use my supposed massive fraud to definitively prove to the terrified board that she has a spectacularly tight grip on internal security, right before they formally vote her in as the new CEO, Dara explained, leaning into his solid warmth. Marcus rested his forehead against hers, his eyes searching her, completely exhausted. Beautiful face in the fading afternoon light, trying to gauge the true toll the day had violently taken on her spirit. Are you truly okay, Dara? Because I know we've strategically planned for this exact day for 7 incredibly long years, but actually seeing you forced to walk up our driveway carrying a box like you've been discarded, it honestly makes my blood boil with absolute rage. I'm perfectly fine, my love, Dara said, her voice finally breaking just a microscopic fraction, briefly revealing the immense, bone-deep emotional exhaustion hidden underneath her ironclad resolve. I'm just so unbelievably tired, Marcus. Tired of 7 years of constantly biting my tongue until it bleeds. 7 years of being routinely treated like a mindless, disposable machine by people with half my intellect. And I just desperately want to finally be myself again. Tomorrow morning, you absolutely will be, Marcus promised fiercely, kissing her forehead with absolute devotion. Tomorrow, you finally stop hiding in the shadows and you proudly wear the crown your grandmother forged for you. That evening, refusing to let the stress completely break them, they sat comfortably on the soft rug of their living room floor, eating their favorite spicy Thai takeout straight from the containers, completely surrounded by the physical, printed copies of the devastating files Dara had meticulously compiled over nearly a decade in the trenches. It wasn't just a damning, irrefutable ledger of horrific financial crimes and corporate malfeasance. It was a highly detailed, visionary blueprint for rebuilding a completely new, vastly superior company from the ashes of the old one. She had rigorously identified all the toxic, abusive middle managers who absolutely needed to be immediately purged to save the corporate culture. And she had brightly highlighted the names of the brilliant, completely unrecognized, and heavily suppressed talent that desperately needed to be rapidly elevated into leadership roles. She paused eating to look down at her wrinkled termination paper one last time, staring at the bold, insulting font that viciously accused her of gross negligence and pompously threatened severe legal action, a document meticulously designed to completely break a normal person's spirit and terrify them into absolute silence. Dara slowly, deliberately tore the offensive letter precisely in half, then meticulously into quarters, and casually dropped the useless confetti into the nearest trash can with a profound sense of absolute finality. She stood up gracefully, walked purposefully down the hall to her large walk-in closet, and immediately bypassed the incredibly dull standard issue, gray skirts, oversized cardigans, and plain, uninspiring blouses she had depressingly worn as her camouflage for nearly a decade, toward the very back of the closet, carefully wrapped in thick, protective plastic and absolutely pristine in its construction, hung a stunning, fiercely tailored, razor-sharp, custom-made white designer suit that practically radiated pure, unadulterated executive authority. Tomorrow morning, the perpetually invisible, deeply humiliated black woman who had silently suffered in the corporate basement was going to make an absolutely unforgettable, earth-shattering entrance that would permanently alter the history of Sterling Global. At exactly 10 o'clock the following morning, the incredibly opulent, glass-walled executive boardroom located on the very top floor of the massive skyscraper was loudly buzzing with the toxic, suffocating arrogance of absolute, inevitable victory as the company's elite gathered to crown their new queen. Valerie smugly sat near the head of the impossibly long, polished glass table, dressed in a phenomenally expensive crimson power suit, graciously accepting premature handshakes, fawning compliments, and sycophantic smiles from the heavily bribed and completely compromised boredom members who were eager to secure their own lucrative futures. Derek sat proudly directly behind her right shoulder, looking unbelievably smug and self-satisfied, casually sipping an expensive imported sparkling water and practically vibrating with the immense thrill of having successfully executed his sloppy but highly effective frame-up of the helpless project coordinator, Arthur Ashford, the distinguished, silver-haired chairman of the board. Slowly and deliberately stood up from his leather chair and sharply tapped his heavy gold monogram pen against a crystal water glass, instantly causing the chaotic, celebratory room to fall into absolute, expectant silence, before we formally proceed with the scheduled, highly anticipated vote to officially appoint the new position of Chief Executive Officer of this great corporation. Ashford's deep, resonant voice rumbled with an undeniable, terrifying authority that immediately made several executives shift uncomfortably in their expensive seats. We must first legally execute the absolute, final, unalterable provision deeply embedded within the late Josephine Sterling's official binding will. Valerie instantly frowned, her perfectly polished, confident veneer slipping slightly as a cold spike of unexpected anxiety hit her stomach. Arthur, my beloved aunt's complex will was completely settled months ago by the legal team, and the full transition of her voting shares was definitively completed, she stated sharply, trying to forcefully regain control of the narrative, not all of the shares. Valerie, not by a long shot, Ashford said incredibly coldly, his eyes locking onto hers with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust as he slowly gestured toward the massive, heavy oak double doors located at the back of the silent room. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, please absolutely allow me the distinct, profound honor to formally introduce the overwhelming majority shareholder, the sole legal heir, and the absolute rightful, uncontested Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Global Holdings. The heavy oak doors swung open smoothly, and Dara confidently stepped into the massive room, completely unrecognizable from the timid, invisible clerk they all thought they knew, as the razor-sharp white suit fit her like flawless, impenetrable armor, radiating an aura of absolute, crushing power. Her posture, usually carefully subdued, slumped, and deeply accommodating, was now incredibly rigid, towering, and terrifyingly commanding, instantly causing the very oxygen in the opulent room to rapidly evaporate as absolute, paralyzing shock violently washed over the assembled executives. Derek literally choked on his expensive sparkling water, coughing violently and uncontrollably into his white linen napkin, his smug face instantly turning a horrifying, blotchy shade of panic-stricken purple as his brain completely failed to process the impossible image standing before him. Valerie's jaw actually, literally dropped open, all the vibrant color instantly draining from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking completely hollow as she hysterically shrieked, "What the hell is this absolute joke? Arthur, because she is a recently terminated, low-level employee who is currently under active federal investigation for massive corporate fraud. So call security right this instant. Sit down and shut your mouth." Valerie. Dara's voice suddenly cracked through the silent room like a literal, devastating whip, projecting not the soft, compliant tone they were all accustomed to ignoring, but rather the terrifying, absolute, commanding voice of the legendary Josephine Sterling, completely reborn. Dara walked incredibly slowly, her heels clicking methodically on the hardwood floor, straight to the actual head of the table, and dramatically dropped a massive, impossibly heavy, leather-bound folder directly onto the glass surface with a deafening, terrifying thwack that made everyone jump. "For 7 agonizing, humiliating years," Dara said smoothly, her piercing, unforgiving eyes panning slowly across the terrified, sweating faces of the trapped executives, I sat quietly in your confidential meetings. I flawlessly formatted your manipulated spreadsheets. I dutifully poured your overpriced coffee. And I absolutely watched every single thing you did. I clearly watched you. Valerie, maliciously and illegally funnel millions in hardworking employee bonus funds directly into your unemployed brother-in-law's fake shell company. And I vividly watched you, Derek, clumsily falsify internal IT logs just yesterday to cowardly frame innocent people for your own pathetic crimes. This is completely insane. You are all crazy, Derek desperately stammered, frantically standing up and violently knocking his chair backward. She's absolutely lying. She's just a vindictive, low-level clerk trying to extort us. I am Dara Sterling, the sole owner of this company, she announced clearly, her powerful name violently echoing off the impenetrable glass walls and completely shattering any remaining illusions of their safety. And every single one of you involved in this massive cover-up is officially and permanently fired. Dara absolutely didn't just stop there with the dramatic, cinematic reveal. Because over the next 20 agonizing, relentlessly brutal minutes, she surgically, methodically, and flawlessly dismantled the entire pathetic illusion of corporate competence in that room, utilizing the projector to display irrefutable proof. She forcefully presented the exact offshore bank routing numbers, the explicitly undeniable IP traces proving Derek's crude tampering, and the deeply heartbreaking, sworn, notarized written testimonies of the dozens of innocent employees who had been brutally bullied, threatened, and forced into silence by Valerie's toxic regime. She then immediately and publicly fired 3 other complicit, high-ranking senior executives directly on the spot, their incredibly lucrative, prestigious careers instantly and permanently incinerated before their imported coffees even had a chance to go cold on the boardroom table. Security was immediately and forcefully called up to the 38th floor, but absolutely not to violently remove Dara, because the heavily armed guards instantly recognized their new, rightful boss, and they instead forcefully escorted a completely hysterical, wildly weeping Valerie and a stark pale, violently shaking, completely ruined Derek completely out of the building. The very same stoic security guards who had coldly marched Dara out the day before in complete disgrace now stood fiercely, proudly, and protectively at her absolute defense, completely loyal to the woman who had just overthrown their corporate oppressors. When the brutal, necessary purge was finally complete and the dust settled, Dara looked coldly at the few remaining, completely stunned, and deeply terrified board members, stating firmly, "We are absolutely no longer a bloated company that blindly rewards proximity to power or family nepotism. From this exact second forward, we exclusively reward radical integrity and actual hard work over the next 3 incredibly busy, chaotic, but profoundly healing months." The newly sanitized Sterling Global Holdings underwent a massive, unprecedented seismic cultural shift, completely transforming its toxic operations into a shining industry standard. Dara absolutely didn't hire arrogant, overpriced external corporate hotshots from rival firms to casually fill the massive, newly empty executive chairs. But instead, she went directly down to the forgotten basement and elevated the people who had always kept the lights on. She proudly and publicly promoted Patricia, the brilliant woman who was horribly bullied into an unjust retirement, completely restoring her pension and making her the new vice president of logistics, effectively putting her in charge of the entire regional network. She happily elevated Thomas, the tragically demoted, incredibly loyal security guard, directly to the prestigious role of chief security officer, publicly giving him unparalleled, absolute authority to heavily protect the entire staff from any future executive abuse. And Elena, the deeply traumatized junior data analyst whose terrible anxiety had tragically driven her away, was warmly brought back with a massive raise, profound apologies, and was given complete autonomy to run her very own advanced data analytics department. Dara fundamentally, permanently changed the exact structural, operational DNA of the massive corporation, rigidly implementing a strictly blind review system for all future internal promotions, absolutely ensuring that the quiet people doing the actual grueling work were the ones rapidly climbing the executive ladder. Exactly 1 year later, on a beautifully quiet, incredibly peaceful evening, Dara stood gracefully by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of her sprawling CEO's corner office, looking thoughtfully out over the vast, glittering city lights that her grandmother had once conquered. Marcus quietly walked in through the heavy double doors, holding 2 steaming cups of their favorite coffee, gently handing her one before warmly wrapping his strong arm around her waist and kissing her cheek. "You actually completely missed the incredibly important board meeting today regarding the new European expansion." He smiled softly, knowing exactly how much she usually loved terrifying the remaining executives with her sharp questions. "I was incredibly busy," Dara replied smoothly, leaning comfortably against his solid shoulder and taking a slow sip of the coffee. "Busy doing exactly what? Considering you are literally the incredibly powerful CEO of this massive international empire," he asked, a knowing, proud smile playing on his lips. "I was down in the basement logistics department," she said softly, her dark eyes fiercely reflecting the beautiful, sprawling city skyline. "I spent an entire hour just casually talking to the newly hired entry-level project coordinators because I wanted to make absolutely, unequivocally sure they knew that in this building, under my watch, absolutely nobody is ever invisible again."